Before we start our discussion, let me introduce to you our discussion, Mr. Mouin Rabbani, Senior Fellow, Institute for Palestine Studies, co-editor of Jadaliyya, and contributing editor of the Middle East Report. He is an independent analyst specializing in Palestinian affairs and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and a contributing editor of Middle East Report. He has also served as a senior analyst Middle East with the International Crisis Group, ICJ, and worked as Palestine director of the Palestinian American Research Center. He was also the project director for the Association of Netherlands Municipalities that established the Association of Palestinian Local Authorities. Mr. Rabbani's writings have also appeared in a number of publications. Mr. Rabbani will make few comments on the presentations we just heard and will help us trigger the discussion with some question. The floor is yours, Mr. Rabbani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think we heard three presentations that were not only very rich in terms of data and information, but also very much speak for themselves. And what I would like to do in the next few minutes is maybe draw out some pertinent conclusions and issues for further discussion. If we begin with the issue of settlements and why that is significant, three reasons come to mind. The first is because objectively and separate from any political issues that arise in the discussion, the establishment of settlements and specifically the forced implantation of population into occupied territory is among the most severe crimes under international law. It's defined as a grave breach under the Fourth Geneva Convention that regulates the administration of occupied territory, and of course is also considered a crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Secondly, I think in the specific context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it forms the very core of Israel's colonial expansion into occupied territory and sits at the very nexus of it. And I think to a greater extent than anything else that Israel has been conducting, it cannot be seen except as an extension of official Israeli policy. The systematic establishment of dozens of settlements with a collective resident population of hundreds of thousands can in no way be attributed to rogue elements or loose collection of extremist vigilantes in Israeli society, but can only be seen as a premeditated, deliberate, and systematic Israeli government policy. Third of all, of course, it is absolutely germane to the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I know it's become fashionable in recent years, particularly in some Western capitals, to characterize settlements and settlement expansion as an obstacle to peace. This is a little like characterizing rigor mortis as an obstacle to cardiovascular health. These settlements are established for a specific purpose, which is to prevent and forestall the Palestinian people from exercising their inalienable right to self-determination as defined by you, the international community, in a series of General Assembly and Security Council resolutions, specifically within the framework of the two-state settlement, meaning an Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 boundaries and a just resolution of the Palestinian refugee question. And settlements are very specifically intended to forestall the implementation of that framework. And that is why they're not only relevant from a legal perspective, but also fundamental to any political approach to this conflict. Excuse me. Now, for the past 50 years, of course, almost the past half century, Israel has been establishing and expanding one settlement after the other. The occupation began in 1967, and here we are in 2015, where, at least in this part of the world, in Europe, in the European Union, finally there is a serious discussion about whether and how Israeli settlement products should be labeled. That's taken almost half a century. I would have thought that a much more logical approach would be to have a discussion about whether the illegal fruit of an illegal enterprise should be afforded any access to this market, which is absolutely essential to Israel, whether under preferential terms or not. But I think this also goes back to another issue, which is the differentiation, if I can put it that way, between the settlements and the occupation. Now, perhaps none of us like military occupation, but it needs to be understood, I think, that military occupation in and of itself is a recognized and legitimate status under international law. There is nothing that is by definition illegal about a military occupation. I think the problem that we have here is that this is a so-called military occupation, which is now almost half a century old. And I think it's an entirely legitimate question to ask whether Israel's presence in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, does or does not conform to military occupation as defined and understood by international law, or whether it has in fact fundamentally transcended any conventional understanding of military occupation, and therefore is itself no longer capable of being defined as in any way legitimate under international law. In other words, is it not time that we go beyond defining Israeli policy within the occupied territories, such as settlement expansion, such as deportation, such as house demolition, and so on, as illegal and illegitimate, but rather look at the more fundamental question of Israel's very presence in these territories and ask whether or not that still conforms to any criteria of legitimacy as understood under the relevant and applicable international laws. And in this respect, also, I would encourage all of you to look at the recent report by the European Council on Foreign Relations, which raises the whole issue of differentiation in terms of how to approach Israeli activity in the occupied territories, and specifically about what European governments, but I think this applies equally to governments around the globe, how to deal with these. In other words, wherever any entity is implicated in activity within the occupied territories that in any way directly or indirectly contributes to that occupation, it needs to be not only terminated in order to prevent any complicity with that activity, but it also needs to be sanctioned. And this is something that goes well beyond not importing avocados from the Jordan Valley or making sure that bananas are properly labeled, but also includes issues such as sanctions on the Israeli banking sector because of its fundamental implication in the occupation and the expansion of the settlement enterprise, and also looking at the preferential status, if I can call it that entities that support the settlement enterprise enjoy in European countries and North America in terms of tax-free donations, in terms of, for example, the many thousands of citizens of these states that are themselves settlers, and so on. And it's a report that came out about a month ago, and I would strongly encourage all of you to look at it. And it's very specific and I think very constructive policy recommendations in this respect. Finally, I think, and several of the speakers raised this, the fundamental issue here is one of impunity. And the fundamental challenge is how to arrest and reverse Israel's impunity in its dealings with the Palestinian people, specifically, I think, in the context of our discussions, in terms of its continued expansion and intensification of the settlement enterprise, and how to transform that impunity into accountability. And it is really only once the impunity has been arrested and reversed and replaced with accountability that we can begin to have serious discussions about how to deal with not only the settlement enterprise, but the fundamental underlying condition, which is that of occupation, which, as I suggested earlier, I think has far transcended any criteria that would give it any form of legitimacy as conventionally understood under international law. And as a final comment, I would say several speakers have spoken about the unsustainability of the status quo, and while the status quo was certainly very undesirable, I think the mere fact that it's been with us for almost half a century suggests that it is unfortunately all too sustainable. And that makes it all the more important, I think, to once again focus on issues of impunity and accountability. Thank you very much.